Now, American commentator and author Bret Stephens is currently visiting Australia to speak at events for the Centre for Independent Studies. Unlike Jerry Seinfeld, Stephens is an American Jew in this country to speak about politics. And he joins me now. Good to speak to you, Bret. I really appreciate your time. It wouldn't surprise you, of course, because you know the ways of the world, but to see a sheikh on a street corner in the suburbs of Sydney preaching such hate against the Jews and such celebration of the atrocities of October the 7th is so confronting for our society, isn't it?
Well, unfortunately, it's the same story in my own hometown of New York City, Chris, where protesters on a New York subway streetcar tried to have a kind of a Judenraus moment by trying to force, quote-unquote, Zionists out of the car, protesting in favor of the October 7th massacres outside of a museum dedicated to memorializing the victims of the Nova Music Festival. So whether in Sydney, New York, London, or other capitals, this is a worldwide phenomenon of extremism, anti-Semitism, and as you just pointed out, really a threat more than just to Jews, but to democratic values everywhere.
Now, this is not a new threat. There's an ideology here afoot, the Islamist ideology, and we've known what a threat it is for many decades, of course, especially since 9/11. To what extent in Western liberal democracies have we just dropped the ball in combating that ideology? Organisations like Hizb ut-Tahrir have continued to operate legally in countries like Australia, and they essentially preach this Islamist message.
Well, look, whether in Australia or elsewhere in the Western democratic world, we obviously subscribe to ideas of free speech, and that means broad latitude for hateful ideas. But what really depresses me and astounds me is that too often the allies of people like the imam you just showcased, the allies they have come from the political left, from so-called progressive forces. And to me, it's just incomprehensible that people who, at least in the context of Western societies, are for gay rights, women's rights, the right to dissent, the right to a pluralistic society, choose to be fellow travelers, in this case, with the most theocratic, fundamentalist and totalitarian movements anywhere, whether it's Hizb ut-Tahrir in London or Hamas in Gaza or other Islamist movements around the world. These are movements who pose the gravest challenge to not just Western values, but also the very values that progressives purport to champion and defend.
Well, that's highlighted, of course, by the oxymoronic queers for Palestine that we see around the place. You just can't get your head around that sort of stupidity. And it brings us to the point, especially when we're looking at the university protests that are ongoing here in Australia and, of course, in your home country, these long-term encampments. To what extent are we to blame for such a poor education system? To what extent are we completely ignorant about the forces at play here?
Well, at least I don't know what it's like in Australia. At least in the United States, the encampments and those protests have largely been confined to some of the most elite, or I should put in quotation marks, elite universities, Columbia, Yale, Harvard, Berkeley in California, the UCLA. It's not a phenomenon you'll find at the University of Nebraska or at Purdue University. So it's confined to specific places that have been teaching a particular kind of ideology and cultivating a worldview where which is a kind of a binary Manichaean view of the righteous oppressed and the vile oppressors, that has very little room for nuance or critical thinking. Really actually demonstrates more than anything else the bankruptcy of some of these institutions of higher learning in terms of the students they select for admission and the ways in which they are being taught. But it is not, to viewers in Australia who might have a different impression, this is not a mass phenomenon in the United States. In fact, when younger voters were asked what issues mattered to them, it was only about 2% of younger voters aged 18 to 29 who said that Gaza was at the top of their priorities. They care about issues like the economy, inflation, immigration. This is a phenomenon relegated to particular places in our culture.
Yeah, well, I think in Australia too, it's a very small minority of activist students. The trouble is the universities are so weak in disciplining them, or at least containing the protest, that it affects all students. It affects the operation of the universities. Let me go from these matters of our own culture to what's playing out on the ground in the Middle East, and just get your thoughts on that, Bret. Benjamin Netanyahu, obviously, as Prime Minister, failed his country in the way October the 7th happened. It was obviously an intelligence failure and a border defence failure. Is he the man to finish the war, to eliminate Hamas and finish this war? Or could we see a change in leadership in Israel before that is done?
Well, I have argued publicly in my column in the New York Times that he's not. And, you know, the argument that Netanyahu has put forward is that, you know, you don't want to change your horse midstream, so to speak, and he started the war and he should finish it. If you think of what the British did in the First World War, they cashiered a failing Prime Minister Asquith and asked Lloyd George to step up. And in fact, that's how they were able to win the war. So my view is Israel would benefit from new leadership, someone who has fewer political interests for wanting to extend the war for longer than it has to go. But Israeli politics, precisely because in some ways it's a small country, are very complicated, and it's unlikely to me that it seems unlikely to me that his coalition is going to fall anytime soon. If it does fall, the likeliest successor to him will not be the opposition leader Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid. It will be his own Likud colleague, the defense minister, Mr. Gallant, who probably has more credibility than he does to hopefully successfully conclude the war with Hamas and perhaps gird for a coming war with Hezbollah in the north. Because I think, sadly and tragically, this conflict is not close to its end. It might not even be close to the beginning of the end, or even the end of the beginning.
Right. Defence Minister Gallant, the other man, of course, targeted by the International Criminal Court, but that's a whole nother wormhole we don't have time to go down now. Thanks so much for joining us, Bret. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoy your stay in Australia. Bret Stephens,
it's a pleasure to be on your show.
Great stuff. Bret Stephens, the New York Times columnist. He's speaking in Sydney tomorrow night and in Melbourne later in the week. If you want to go to the CIS website, that's cis.org.au, you can have a look at details for that and get yourself along. One of the brightest, most informed and more contrarian, free-minded columnists in the Western-speaking world.